Well, thank you, Carlo. It's nice to be with you all. I've been to Indonesia twice and have very much enjoyed my visits each time, and meeting many of you, becoming friends with several of you. I want to thank SOLA SCRIPTURA for bringing me over those two times and for setting up this time where we could get together and discuss some of these things. I'm excited about talking about the Gospels. My primary research has been, at least over the years, has been with the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. However, you just saw a couple of the debates, 3 of the debates in which I've been involved. I've actually had 34 public debates. And my first debate with Bart Ehrman occurred in 2008. And then I had another in 2009. And in both cases, Ehrman, we were debating on the resurrection of Jesus. And Ehrman's primary objection was the unreliability of the Gospels. And I was teaching a graduate class shortly after that second debate. And the class acknowledged, they thought that I had clearly won the debate on the resurrection of Jesus. But because I had not taken time to answer Ehrman's objections to the Gospels, it really shook the faith of many of those Christians who attended the debates. So I did some research and put together a presentation about these 5 major objections that Bart Ehrman gives against the Gospels. And these aren't unique for Ehrman. They are objections that are offered by many skeptics who object to the reliability of the Gospels. I spent more attention on the matter of gospel contradictions than anything else. We're going to deal with these 5 objections today. And we'll spend a little time on the contradictions, but next week we'll spend the entire time on contradictions. So these 5 objections, I was able to put together a lecture answering them in a very convenient way. I don't know what it's like in Indonesian, but the first 5 letters of the English alphabet are A, B, C, D, E. And I was able to match up these objections with the first 5 letters in the English alphabet. The first one, and it just helps us remember these things. The first is authorship, A for authorship. And one of the primary objections against the authorship of the Gospels, and when I say the authorship, I mean the traditional authorship of the Gospels. The positions that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels. That's the traditional authorship. And that has been taken into serious question in recent years, the past century or so. The primary reason is skeptics will say, we don't know who wrote the Gospels because they are anonymous. Now we can go to maybe we should put up my PowerPoint presentation at this point. And you'll have to let me know if it's on because I'm not seeing it on my screen. But we want to do authorship. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And one more. And so they say that the Gospels are anonymous, that in the earliest manuscripts, they do not contain the author's name, like the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel according to John. That's not on there. So in that sense, they're anonymous, and it is claimed that we don't know who wrote them. And if we don't know who wrote them, how do we know we can trust anything that they're saying? All right, let's go to the next slide. The problem with skeptics who say this is they're not familiar, apparently, with literature outside the biblical literature. Sallust lived in the 1st century before Christ. I think it was the year 35 that he died. He wrote all of his literature before the year 40 BC. He wrote what's called the War with Catiline, the War with Jugurtha, and the Histories. And then you have Livy. Livy was a great Roman historian, one of the best. He wrote in the final half of the 1st century BC, and he wrote in the first part of the 1st century, but he died in the early 1st century. And then there is Plutarch. Plutarch is regarded as the greatest ancient biographer. Plutarch was born in the year 40, around that time, and he died shortly after the year 120. Much of what we know about the ancient world is written by Plutarch. Now, Sallust, maybe you've heard of Livy and Plutarch, but you haven't heard of Sallust. Sallust was a great Roman historian. In fact, there was a Roman rhetorician in the 1st century, a famous one named Quintilian. And he said that Sallust was a better historian than Livy, and that one must be well advanced in their studies in order to appreciate Sallust properly. Now, with that in mind, it is interesting to note that of all 3 of these authors, their names do not appear in the title, and their names do not appear anywhere in the documents in the literature they wrote. The literature that Sallust, Livy, and Plutarch wrote are just as anonymous as the Gospels. And yet, we seem to know who wrote them. Why is that? Because there are external sources that talk about the authorship. So, for example, when it comes to Sallust, the first person to mention his war with Catiline and war with Jugurtha is Quintilian, who wrote more than 135 years after Sallust wrote. The first person to mention the biographies written by Plutarch is called the Lamprias Catalog. Let's go 2 more slides. Advance 2 slides, please. And you'll see the Lamprias Catalog. Plutarch died around the year 120. The Lamprias Catalog, we don't know when it was written, but most scholars think that it was written at least 100 years after Plutarch, and probably closer to 200 years or even later after Plutarch. And it is falsely attributed to Plutarch's son. This is our first and best source that discusses Plutarch, that Plutarch wrote those biographies. Now, all right, we need to go back to the PowerPoint presentation, please. Okay, go to the next slide. Let's compare this. Let's compare this with what we have for the Gospels. The first person who talks about the authorship of the Gospels is Papias. We don't know exactly when he wrote, but it's somewhere between the years 100 and 130. And he mentions the authorship of the Gospels, Matthew and Mark. Now, what's interesting about this is Papias says he got his information from one of Jesus, from an associate of one of Jesus' disciples, and while that disciple was out preaching. So that means that Papias received this information about Matthew and Mark writing the Gospels in the latter part of the first century, within only a few decades of when it was written, when these two Gospels were written. And he's writing this within no more than 35 years after the Gospel of John was written. Then you have a guy named Marcion around the year 145, and he mentions the Gospel, one of them written by Luke. You have Justin Martyr in the year 150. He mentions the authorship of Mark and Luke. And then you have these others. I'm not going to get into all of them, but you can see we have many different sources in just the first 200 years after Jesus, and probably the first 175 years after the Gospels were written, many sources that attest to them being written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And within this time period, it's unanimous. It's written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So our evidence that we have that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is better than the evidence we have for Plutarch writing those biographies. It is better than a lot of the evidence we have for other ancient historians. It is not perfect evidence, but it's very good. All right, let's go to the next slide. Bias. When we speak about authorship, we can see that there is some good reason to believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote those Gospels, or at least that they were involved in the somehow involved in the composition of those Gospels. They probably had secretaries, people who were doing the writing for them, people who would take notes from the apostles and then write down the gospel and then let the apostle read it, make recommendations, make the changes, and then a final draft would be created, and that's the gospel. So there's good reason to think that the traditional authorship of the Gospels is probably true. Bias. It's often said that by skeptics that we can't believe the Gospels because their authors were biased. Let's go to the next slide. Many years ago, there was the Holocaust, and Hitler killed millions of Jews, millions of gypsies, mentally retarded people, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and others. Now, if we're going to say that a person, if they are biased, then they cannot write on the particular subject on which they're biased, then we would have to say that a Jewish historian could not write on the Holocaust because they would be biased. Now, a little over 150 years ago in my country, the United States, there was a civil war. And the war was over the matter of slavery. That was a main issue involved, slavery. There were other issues, but slavery was one of the main issues. Now, there were a lot of blacks that were brought here from Africa and made slaves. And until it was abolished nearly 150 years ago, we had slavery here. Would we say that a Black American historian should not write on slavery in the United States because that Black historian would be biased? Well, of course we wouldn't say that. And we wouldn't say a Jewish historian should not write on the Holocaust. And we shouldn't say that someone who either knew Jesus or knew those who knew Jesus should not write on Jesus, because they would be the very best people to write about Jesus. Would they be biased? Yes, but that bias could actually motivate them to report more and to report things accurately. Let's go to the next slide. Christians aren't the only ones who are biased. Gerd Lühlemann is a German New Testament scholar. He is also an atheist. And in 2004, he wrote a book about the resurrection of Jesus. And in that book, he mentioned another book that he wrote on the resurrection of Jesus a few years earlier. And speaking of that book, he says, its aim was to prove the non-historicity of the resurrection of Jesus and simultaneously to encourage Christians to change their faith accordingly. Ludemann is an atheist, and he's writing because he wants to persuade Christians to leave the Christian faith. He's biased. He has an agenda. Let's look at another example. Richard Dawkins. He is a militant atheist scientist who retired a few years ago from Oxford. Several years ago, he wrote a book titled The God Delusion. And in that book, he wrote, if this book works as I intend, religious readers who open it will be atheists when they put it down. Dawkins is obviously biased, and he obviously has an agenda, just like Ludemann. But that does not mean that their arguments are wrong. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that what they're saying is wrong because they're biased. Now, both of them are wrong because their arguments are poor, but we shouldn't not listen to them just because they're biased. Biased has nothing to do with it. It's the matter of the arguments and the data that they present. And the same thing goes for the Gospels. Let's go to the next slide. So now we come to the C. We've dealt with A, authorship, B, bias. C, contradictions. Contradictions has been the number one objection to the reliability of the Gospels. So Bart Ehrman and many skeptics have made claims. They will talk about the various differences in the Gospels and say we just can't believe them because of that. Was Jesus crucified after the Passover meal or before the Passover meal? He answers, it depends which gospel you read. Since Jesus was crucified between two thieves, did both thieves curse him, or did one thief repent? It depends which gospel you read. And on he goes and names all these differences in the Gospels, in the crucifixion scene, in the resurrection scene, and by the end, he has a lot of Christians doubting that the Gospels can be trusted. I want to make a couple of points this week. I want to make two major points this week, and I think they're the two most important points when it comes to contradictions. Now, the third point, I think, is the most interesting. And the third point resolves almost all of the differences in the Gospels. However, it's not the most important point. Next week, we will be talking about the most interesting point, but let's talk about 2 points now, and they're very important. Next slide. Around 100 years ago, there was a boat. Okay, let's go one more. I'm sorry. There was a boat called the Titanic, and it was a little over 300 feet long. It's very long. That's about as long as a football field here in the United States. And it was regarded as unsinkable, that it was so strong you could not sink it. And on a cold April evening in 1912, it was sailing across the Atlantic. It hit an iceberg and it sank. More than half of its passengers died because of the lack of lifeboats. Now, later on, when the survivors were being interviewed, some of them said that the Titanic broke in half just before it sank. Others swore that it went down in one piece, that it did not break in half. Now, how do you get that wrong? I don't know. It's a cold night. You're out in a lifeboat. It was reported that it was clear weather, no moon in the sky that night. So the only light visible was coming from the stars and from the boat. And that's all you could see. So how do you miss it if the boat breaks in half and sinks, or if it doesn't? We will not know the answer to that, but it is noteworthy that no one questions that the Titanic sank. No one questions the reliability of the eyewitnesses, the survivor who said that it sank. We just conclude that the eyewitnesses got some minor details confused. That's all. So what this means for the Gospels is, even if there was some contradictions, real contradictions in minor details, was there one angel or were there two angels at the tomb? If it turns out that that was a contradiction, did one thief curse Jesus or did both thieves curse him? If it turned out that that was a contradiction and an error, it wouldn't mean that Jesus wasn't crucified. It would just mean that we don't know the answer to some minor discrepancies. That's all. All right, let's look at our next point. Next slide. We ask whether what we are looking at is a contradiction or a difference. Now, let's go to the next slide. When we talk about the Titanic, if somebody says it broke in half and then it sank, and another person says it did not break in half before it sank, that is a contradiction. It cannot be resolved. But sometimes what appears to be a contradiction is only a difference. Let's go to the next slide. I travel a lot, or I did before COVID. Now, let's suppose that I was in Indonesia and then I came home, and this is make-believe right here, but I came home and my wife's very excited and she says, I was reading 30 minutes ago and the doorbell rang. I went to the door and there was a man standing there and saying, you had won a contest and had won $10 million. And that we're now rich. Well, I would be pretty excited. But let's say 30 minutes after that, my wife is talking to her mom on the phone, and I hear her tell the same story, except she also says, a guy gave me this big check for $10 million, and another guy was video recording this all. When she got off the phone, I would not say, you lied to me because you said there was only one guy and you told your mom there were two. My wife would respond that she did not say there was only one guy, but that she had mentioned only the one guy who had given her the check. That is not a contradiction. It is a difference. We have many examples like this in the Gospels. Let me give you a few examples. I hope I'm talking slowly enough for Ina. I'm trying to keep that in mind for our translator. So when the Gospels report about women going to the tomb on Easter morning, they differ. Matthew, Mark, and Luke discuss several women going to the tomb, but John only mentions Mary Magdalene. Now, is that a contradiction? Well, if you read John chapter 20, verse 1, it does mention only Mary Magdalene going to the tomb. But in the next verse, she comes back and she says, they have taken the Lord. She finds Peter and the beloved disciple and says, they have taken the Lord and we don't know where they have laid him. Who's we? It has to be referring to the other women, because she wouldn't be referring to Peter and the beloved disciple. Of course, they wouldn't know where the body had been taken, because they didn't even know the tomb was empty until then. And then we find the Gospel of John reporting that Peter and the beloved disciple went to the tomb and found it as Mary had said. Luke reports that when the women said the tomb was empty and that they had seen an angel who had announced that Jesus had been raised from the dead, that Peter got up and ran to the tomb and found it as the women had said. So was it just Peter, or was it Peter and the beloved disciple? Well, Luke doesn't say it was just Peter. In fact, I believe it's 12 verses later, Jesus is having the Emmaus disciples, and it says that their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And as he's discussing with them, they don't recognize him, and they're telling him the story that earlier that day, their women disciples, friends, went to the tomb, saw angels who had said Jesus had been raised, and then some of their own, multiple people went to the tomb and found it as the women had said. This is the same gospel that only 12 verses earlier, Luke only mentions Peter, but that doesn't mean he believed only Peter went to the tomb. He's only mentioning Peter because Peter's the most important disciple at that point, the leader of the 12. So that is a difference. It is not a discrepancy. It is not a contradiction. It is a difference. Okay, let's go to the next one, please. And one more. So the third point, I think these first 2 points are really important, because some people think that if the Gospels actually had contradictions, that it would totally discredit them. I think we have seen that is not the case. It would only mean that we can't know certain things about minor details. That's all it would mean. And in fact, if you read the ancient literature, you find that many of the ancient accounts also have discrepancies with minor details. The assassination of Julius Caesar is reported by many different ancient historians, and there are many discrepancies of minor details in those stories. But no one turns around and thinks that the stories are unreliable or that Caesar was not assassinated. And then the second point we looked at is that you've got to distinguish between a contradiction and a difference. And there are many differences in the Gospels that aren't contradictions. And then the third is it really helps us understand the Gospels better if we understand them as biographies. And that's because you think about it from, of course, they're Gospels. Gospels in the sense that gospel is good news. They are bringing good news. But gospel was not in the original title. This was a name given to them later on. But they are books that feature the life of Jesus, which means they're biographies. So what does that mean in terms of how we read them and how this might shed light on gospel differences? We will be looking at that next week, and I promise you it is a fascinating, fascinating topic. All right, next slide. And we go here to look at D, dating. We've looked at authorship, A, bias, B, contradictions, C, D, dating, meaning when were the Gospels dated? When were they written? And you will have many skeptics who will say that they were written too long after the life of Jesus, and nobody can remember things accurately for that long period of time. So I think that they are mistaken terribly again. Let's go to the next slide. Alexander the Great is one of the most noteworthy figures in human history. He died in the year 323 BC. Now, there are several sources who mention Alexander, but our two chief sources, next slide, is Arian, who writes around the year 100 AD, and Plutarch, who writes about him around the year 110. Both are writing more than 400 years after Plutarch died. And I'm sorry, after Alexander died. And these are our two best sources about Alexander. Next slide. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written somewhere between the years 50 and 100, or within only 20 to 70 years at the most after Jesus had died. So if 20 to 70 years is too long, well, then there's going to be virtually nothing that we can know about Alexander the Great. I could do this and this comparison with many other ancient figures. 20 to 70 years is not that long. In fact, it was 75 years ago that World War II ended. We just celebrated that in the United States 2 days ago. 75 years ago. I have a man at my church who flew on bombers over Germany in World War II. An eyewitness who is still alive 75 years later, who can be spoken with to learn about his experiences. And he's, I think he's 97 years old. Okay. So 70 years isn't too long. And it has been estimated that when the Gospel of John was written, there were still somewhere around 600 to 1,100 eyewitnesses of Jesus who were still alive. And what about Mark's Gospel? Mark's Gospel was written closer to the life of Jesus than the Vietnam War is to us today. I've got a neighbor who lives just a couple of houses down from me who fought in the Vietnam War for the United States. And we go shooting sometimes at the range. I don't know, maybe, I don't know if you're allowed to have pistols in Indonesia. We can have guns here in the United States, and we go to the range and go shooting sometimes. And we'll talk about Vietnam. And it seems like a long time ago to us, but for him, it's like yesterday. he's still shaken up over many of the things that he saw while he was over there. And it's estimated that when the Gospel of Mark was written, there were somewhere between 13,000 and 15,000 eyewitnesses of Jesus who were still alive. So it's not that long. And finally, E, eyewitness. Next slide. Skeptics will say that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses. Remember, in the first, they say we have no idea who wrote them, and then they will say they were not written by eyewitnesses. They do not contain eyewitness testimony. But let's look at this claim for a moment. Next slide. The traditional view that was given to us by the early church fathers is that the author of what we call the Gospel of Matthew was a disciple of Jesus, one of the 12, a tax collector he had been. Mark was an associate of the Apostle Peter. He knew Peter, and Peter had told him stories about Jesus, and that Mark wrote down. Luke does not claim to be an eyewitness, but in the second, I think it's the second verse of Luke's gospel, he says he received his information from the eyewitnesses. Actually, the traditional view is that he received them from the eyewitnesses, yes. And then there's John, and the traditional view is that John was the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus's 12 disciples. In fact, one of Jesus' 3 closest disciples. That's the traditional view. So with this view, that would be 2 eyewitnesses, and then the other 2 got their information from eyewitnesses. Now let's go to the next slide. This is the view of the majority of modern scholars today. And when I say that, I'm referring to atheists, agnostics, Jewish, liberal, people like Bart Ehrman, people like, skeptical scholars, and then you got conservative Christian scholars. I'm referring to all of them. And the majority, not unanimous view, but the majority view is that we do not know who wrote Matthew. Now, it gets complicated. I think that Matthew, personally, I think there's good evidence that Matthew was involved in the writing of his gospel. I'm not going to get into that here. The point I just want to make is not the authorship here, but at minimum, what even the modern scholarship thinks that we have. Mark, the majority of modern scholars do think that the traditional authorship of Mark is correct, and that he received the majority of his information from Peter. That's pretty good. It's just the same as the traditional authorship. With Luke, what they believe about Luke is close to the traditional authorship. The majority of today's scholars do think that Luke was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, just like the book of Acts says. However, they pull up short from agreeing that his name was Luke. But they will say he was a traveling companion of Paul, and that he received his information either from the apostles or those who had heard the apostles, or from both. So it's pretty close to the traditional view. With John, most of modern scholars today do not think John, the son of Zebedee, wrote the gospel that has been attributed to him. But they do think that whoever wrote it received much of the information from one of Jesus's other disciples, which would still be an eyewitness and would still be on the same level as the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke. So I'm not saying the majority of what the majority of scholars believe today is correct. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is even the majority view of scholars today believe that at least 3 of the Gospels are rooted in eyewitness testimony from Jesus' disciples. So skeptical scholars can argue all they want and try to say, well, we don't know who wrote the Gospels. They weren't written by eyewitnesses, but they were still rooted in eyewitness testimony. And that's pretty strong. It would be like hearing it from the wife of a person who fought in World War II, or the close friend of a person who had fought in Vietnam, and they're able to tell the stories that they had been told. It's still pretty good. All right, next slide. We're going to wrap it up here. Let me just summarize. Talked about 5 things today, 5 major objections to the Gospels, and have provided answers to those: authorship, bias, contradictions, dating, and eyewitness. I'll take some questions in a moment. I just want to show one more slide. Next one. Once this is over, you can get more information from 2 places from me. One is my YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and type in my name, Mike Licona. We've got over 200 videos on my channel, many debates, many lectures, some things there that I think will be very helpful. When you go to that channel, you can scroll down, and I have 10 lectures on the historical reliability of the Gospels. One of them covers the ABCs that we talked about today, not the D's and the E's. It was a shorter lecture, but you can see me lecture on those first 3. And then my website, risenjesus.com. I've got articles and some videos and things there. So I welcome you to go there. Either of those places, you'll probably get more information on my YouTube channel, and I hope that can be helpful to you. And now I'm happy to take your questions.
I'm going to move on for the Q&A session. We have several questions, Mike, already on the chat room and the Q&A. Probably I will inform again for the participants to raise your questions in Q&A, not in the chat. Mike, number one from me first. I saw in your website, Mike, you said like this: I often tell my students you must pursue truth rather than protect your presuppositions. Mike, what do you mean by that? What's wrong with presuppositions?
Nothing's wrong with presuppositions, Hartman. I think the problem is that we allow ourselves many times to be guided by our presuppositions on a question for which we don't know the answer. And it is our presuppositions that end up providing the answer rather than the data. Think about what's happening in science so often. They have the presupposition that everything, that many atheist scientists, that is, they have the presupposition that everything is here by natural causes, that there was no intelligent designer around. So when people, some other scientists say, here's some scientific data, and this provides evidence that there was an intelligent designer of some sort who created the universe and life itself. And the scientists will dismiss that. Some of them will dismiss it because of their presuppositions that everything has a natural cause. In that case, they are allowing their presuppositions to serve as the referee that makes the decision on whether it's true or false, rather than the data itself. I think if we're going to be responsible when we come to Scripture, we should allow Scripture to speak for itself. So sometimes that may mean that we need to adjust some of our presuppositions. Some of our theology may be needed, or else we just embrace a theological view and we never change regardless of the evidence.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Yeah, I think that's how we should be, pursuing. All right. Have the question, Mike, from Pak Yongki Karman. You consider evangelists wrote the Gospels as if they were modern reporters or historians, which is, I'm afraid, actually not the case. However, their theological bias would not necessarily make their writings as religious fantasies. I do not think it is appropriate to call the evangelists as Jesus' biographer, unless you define biography in a spatial sense, a biography with detail at very minimum level. I love to quote the way John ends his gospel. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And that by believing you may have life in his name. John 20:31. I did not see your differentiate the level of historicity between Luke and John. For example, is not John more theological than Luke? Good presentation anyway. Thanks. God bless.
Yeah, well, I would certainly agree that there is a difference between John and Luke. In fact, even most conservative New Testament scholars agree that there is a big difference between John and the other three Gospels. There is a British scholar named N.T. Wright who has a pretty funny thing he says. I laugh when I think about him saying it. He says, I feel about John like I feel about my wife. I love her very much, but I don't claim to understand her. Another prominent evangelical conservative Christian scholar named Paul Anderson has specialized in the Johannine literature, and he refers to John as a theological paraphrase. And then many of you may have heard, at least if you've been to Bible school in any sense, you've probably heard of the biblical scholar F.F. Bruce, who died about 30 years ago. But he was very conservative, very solid Christian scholar. And in his commentary on John's gospel, he says that the Gospel of John is an expanded paraphrase, a translation of the freest kind, and a transposition into another key, and so much more. So even conservative scholars agree that there is a difference between John and the other three Gospels. And trying to figure out what is actually going on in John's Gospel is difficult at times, very difficult. So when I talk about I can acknowledge that though, but by far, most New Testament scholars do think that all four Gospels are biographies of Jesus. What other genre would they be? They're not poetry. They're not fiction. They're not horror. They're what are they if they're not biographies? They are reports about the life of a single person. A history, like the book of Acts, doesn't focus on a single person. It reports historical events and does so, but without focusing on a single person. All of the other biblical literature falls into some category of genre that was available at the time of writing. Why are we to think that the Gospels would have been so unique that God would have done something different? He did the rest of the New Testament in the genre of letters, apocalyptic, like with Revelation. That was around. Revelation was not the only one written like that in that time. There was First Enoch and Fourth Ezra, two Jewish writings that had the same genre. You've got the book of Hebrews, which is a sermon, a homily. So all the biblical literature is written according to some genre. I don't think the Gospels are an exception to that. They are biographies because they're written about the life of a single person, who is Jesus. Yes, they do include theological claims, and that's okay. Other ancient biographies made theological claims. They also reported some supernatural events, but we don't discount them as biographies because of that. These are biographies of a teacher, of Jesus, of a religious teacher. Actually, they're biographies of God's uniquely divine Son. And they do have theological claims in it, but that doesn't undermine that they're biographies. But thanks for your comment.
Next, quick answer, Mike, from you, please. The book of Hebrews, probably this is, I don't know whether this is out of the question, but this is very interesting. The book of Hebrews, we don't know the author until now. There's only assumptions that the author was Apollos or Luke or Barnabas or Priscilla. So the author was unknown up to today, but God knows. How could we encourage people that the Hebrew is the word of God? Just quick question, quick answer.
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, on the 24th of this month, I'm going to be interviewing the #1 expert in the world on matters related to the canon. Which books are, or which books should and should not be in the Bible, and how it came to be. And there will be 3 lectures or interviews, one that deals with the Old Testament, one that deals with the literature that's in the Catholic and Orthodox Bibles between the Testaments, the Apocrypha, and then literature, the New Testament canon. And those will be published on my YouTube channel sometime in October, all 3 of them in October. So stay tuned, go to my YouTube channel, subscribe, and hit that little bell icon so that you'll be notified when new videos come out.
Okay, stay tuned, right? All right, another question. I believe that Gospels, do not have contradictions, but more on paradox. And then probably issues will be solved. However, a lot of factors might affect Gospels as paradox. Yeah, again, one of them is presupposition. How could you, tackle this presupposition in the context difference in the Gospel?
Well, I think that is a presupposition. When you presuppose that the Gospels have no contradictions or any kinds of errors in it. And why is that? It's based upon the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. And here's where I think you have to look and say that it's fine to believe the Bible is inerrant, but you have to be open to the possibility that it isn't. And then you ask yourself, if there is an error in the Bible, what does that mean? And these are really interesting questions. I'm writing another book on gospel differences now. I'm writing it. I hope to have it done by next June, and then it will be out a little bit after that. I might even have it completed before next June. And by the way, I wasn't going to write such a book, but when I was over there in Indonesia 2 years ago, I was told by SOLA SCRIPTURA that many people had requested such a book. So I decided I was going to do it at that point while I was over there last time. So I will be dealing with issues like that in the book. I think a lot of it depends on how we view the process of divine inspiration. This is stuff that I talk to my students about. I would encourage you to go to my YouTube channel, and there's a debate that I did October last year with a Christian philosopher named Richard Howell. Richard Howell and I are friends, and we debated on the matter of biblical inerrancy. I'd encourage you to go view that video because I think it will, give you my position in more detail than I can give you right here. And then when my book comes out, you know, it will more fully articulate that. But check out that video, and then we can talk about it more at another time.
Yeah, right.
I think the title of the video is the Bible Inerrant?
All right. Yeah, we have several questions about that. Thank you for covering it up, about the inerrancy and infallibility. I think you pretty much covered that. About a different chronological event, you're going to cover that next week, Mike?
Yeah, I will. I believe I will. I'm trying to think about my, I mean, certainly one of the compositional devices that could be used in antiquity by ancient authors was actually changing chronology. And I can give examples of where, like, Plutarch and others did it.
Yeah.
So that was not considered a major thing to give attention to when writing ancient biography.
Yeah. So, brothers and sisters, please ensure yourself to attend next week, because Mike will, fascinate you. All right. Quick question. Is it fair to compare today's news transmission or digital technology with the first century news transmission?
No, it's not fair to do that. And I think that's an excellent question. It's wrong for us to imagine how things occurred in antiquity as though they happen in the same way we have today. I have a friend, he's a scholar who teaches at Palm Beach Atlantic University. His name's Randy Richards. And he wrote a groundbreaking book back in, I believe it was in the 1990s, based on his doctoral research. And let's see here. This is it right here. Paul and first century letter writing. It's an excellent book. And he did this groundbreaking research and about the use of what are called secretaries, or the academic theological term is amanuensis. And a secretary would have been someone like a scribe who would have written down what, compose documents for you, take dictation, things like that. And Richard says that we imagine that today of the Apostle Paul dictating a letter to his secretary, who wrote down word for word what Paul wanted him to write. But that's not the way it happened. And what he does as an exercise for his students is he gives each of them a piece of papyrus that's like paper that they would have written on back then. And he gives each of them a reed and some ink. So they don't have these pens like we do today. They just take the reed, you stick it in the ink, and then you write with it slowly. You got to write slowly because the papyrus isn't really smooth. And he says, okay, I want you all now to write what I say to you. Paul, an apostle. They pick up the reed, they dip it in the ink, and they start writing Paul, U-L-A-N, dip it back in the ink, A-P, and then they write out apostle. Of Jesus Christ. It take another minute to do that. By the will of God. Can you imagine how long it would take to dictate a letter that way, and how difficult it would be to maintain the continuity of your thought? So you look at this and you say, wow, okay, well, how did it happen? It was probably more like Paul sits down, talks to the secretary, tells the secretary a number of things that he wants in the letter. The secretary takes some notes, and then the secretary composes the letter, brings it back to Paul. Paul reads it, makes suggested changes. The secretary goes back, rewrites it with those changes, presents it to Paul. Paul reads it, says, this is good. And then at the very end, he says, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. So the secretary did a lot of editing. And that's a lot how if this is going to be the way it occurs with letters, then a secretary is going to be far more involved when it comes to writing a gospel, a biography, which is much longer than a letter. And keep in mind too, that none of the disciples, not even Matthew, that even if they were literate, they would not have been skilled enough to write a biography of Jesus. And so they almost certainly used secretaries to do it.
Okay. I like, I think this is a very nice question for Ibu Imelda Natalia. How important is to have an ancient knowledge to understand the Bible properly? This is why we have this seminar. How about us who don't have theological background? Is there any book to help? Please, Mike.
Well, that's why it's important to have seminars like this, and why I'm so happy to participate and why others are, because SOLA SCRIPTURA is a wonderful organization that tries to bridge the gap between scholars and people who haven't had the time or the interest to devote themselves to these things. For the most part, you don't need a seminary education in order to understand the Bible accurately. However, understanding how things were done in antiquity certainly contribute and help you gain a more accurate knowledge in many things in the Bible. For example, Jesus says in his Sermon on the Mount, if your right hand makes you stumble, sin, cut it off and throw it from you. Well, I hope no one who is in this meeting right now has ever done that, because Jesus isn't meaning that in a literal sense. Well, I would ask you, why is it that you don't think he's being literal there? I mean, after all, the text says, if your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off, because it is better to lose one of your body parts than for your whole body to be cast into hell. What is it about that text that would lead you to think that Jesus was not speaking in literal terms of cutting your hand off? I don't think there's anything apparent in the text itself that would suggest Jesus did not mean for us to cut our hand off. But when you read other ancient literature, for example, Seneca, I believe Seneca the Younger, he said, if your heart is evil, rip it out. He's not talking about actually committing suicide by ripping your own heart out. This was rhetoric. It was a figure of speech. Paul says it a little bit differently. He says, consider the members of your earthly body as being dead to immorality, impurity, evil desire, passion, and greed. So, to put it a little bit differently, in Paul's words, he's saying, if you think of yourself, the next time you're tempted, guys, the next time you're tempted to look on a woman lustfully, just imagine yourself being blind, because a blind person can't look lustfully on a woman. The next time you think about hurting someone with the words of your mouth, by insulting them, imagine as though you don't have a tongue, that you can't speak, because people who cannot speak cannot insult others with their tongue. So by understanding the figures of speech in the past, it brings us closer to gaining an accurate understanding of Scripture. Now, I would say probably 90 to 95%. This is a wild guess. I don't know. I've never thought about this, but I would guess 90 to 95% of the Scripture can be understood quite clearly without knowledge about antiquity. But it's when you learn some of these things about antiquity and the way they wrote that it's like digging in a a diamond mine and you come across diamonds that just open up your eyes to see things in scripture you just never saw before. And what if that was only 5% of scripture? What if it was only 3% of the New Testament? And by reading the New Testament and having these understandings, you just got gems of insights into what scripture means there. It's a lot of fun. And that's why I stay in the kind of scholarship that I do. I love what I do.
It's still the case, Mike. Like in US, you said the car costs me arms and legs, right? It doesn't mean that you lose your legs, right? Okay, Mike, can we still start the Gospels because we don't have the autographs? Probably, you want to answer that?
Sure. In fact, it's interesting you ask that. I've got a book right here. It was just supposed it was off the shelf at this moment. Let's see if you can.
Move it to the middle. Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Okay. There we go.
Yeah.
Text and Transmission, edited by L.D. Reynolds. It's published by Oxford University Press. And if you want to buy it from Oxford, it's only $400. Serious.
Because you arms and legs, right?
Yeah, it really is a $400 book. I couldn't afford it. So because I've published with Oxford University Press, I asked them if I could get a discount. And as a favor, they sent it to me for free. So I was like, all right. What this book does is it's a survey of the Latin classics. And what that means is they go through, there are nearly 100 Latin authors from antiquity. People like Tacitus and Cicero, Asconius, Ovid, Livy, Sallust. These were Quintilian. They were all Latin authors. Julius Caesar. And want to know about the manuscripts that we have for those. Well, let me just give you an idea. For Tacitus, who is regarded as the greatest Roman historian, when we talk about his Annals of Rome, there are, I think, 16 books in the Annals of Rome. We have, for books 1 through 6, we have one manuscript. 7 through 10 are missing. We have no manuscripts for 7 through 10. Those books are missing. And 11 through 16, we have one manuscript. And in both cases, when we have that one manuscript, it's dated to the 11th century. Tacitus wrote in the early 2nd century. So we have one manuscript that's written 700 years later. That's the only manuscript we have for those. It's not the first, it's the first and the only one. When we talk about Plutarch's lives, much of what we know about the ancient world comes from that. We have about 50 manuscripts. Now, we do have one fragment that was written less than 100 years after the autographs. Other than that, almost all of the manuscripts of Plutarch's lives are written between the 9th and 15th centuries. And Plutarch wrote in the early 2nd century. The manuscripts we have for the New Testament are so much better. So I just interviewed Dan Wallace on this recently. He's a leading expert on this topic. We have about 5,500 Greek manuscripts of our New Testament. We have 2 manuscripts written in the 4th century that have virtually the entire New Testament. One of them has the entire New Testament. The other has the entire New Testament except, I think it's Philemon, Revelation, and Colossians. Other than that, it's the entire New Testament. Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. So those are two major ones there, and they're written just 3 centuries after the Gospels were written. Entire manuscripts. We have between 9 and 15 manuscripts of our New Testament that are dated to within 150 years of the originals. That's just amazing. So even the skeptic Bart Ehrman says that the evidence, manuscript evidence we have for the New Testament is better than anything else in antiquity. So if we're not going to trust the New Testament, then we can't trust any ancient writing, because what we have for the New Testament is much, much better than for any other ancient writing.
Okay, thank you. Right, thank you, brothers and sisters.
Let me say one thing here. If you
sorry.
want to hear my interview, my discussion with Dan Wallace on this, it's on my YouTube channel now. We just posted it a couple of weeks ago, and it's gotten a lot of attention. You'll find it very interesting.
Yeah, I've watched that. Thank you, brothers and sisters, for your burning questions to Mike, or stimulating questions. Mike, another question, good question related to your material about eyewitness. All right. When was the Gospel of Matthew written? And then is he eyewitness?
Okay, that's a good question. We really don't know when Matthew was written. Some like to date him, Matthew, in the 50s, early 50s. The tendency of scholars today is to date it in the 70s or 80s. I think that's too late. In truth, we really don't know, because the only person in antiquity that it's given a date for, Eusebius gives a date for when the Gospel of John was written. I think it was he says that we would call it the year 96 today. But Eusebius is often unreliable. So it may be that John wrote in the last decade. It was 95 or 96. And I think that's the typical date that most scholars put John at. Even though there's some good evidence that John was written prior to the year 70, it's just hard to tell. I do think that Matthew was involved in the penning of that gospel. I scrolled through some of these questions here, and some of you asked about the two-source hypothesis or the Q theory. Let me just say something. Here's what Q is. Almost all scholars today, not all of them, but at least a good 90%, and that includes conservative scholars like myself, agree that Mark was probably the first gospel that was written, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as their primary source and supplemented him. There are good reasons for thinking this. I just can't get into them now. There's also a lot of information that is virtually verbatim between Matthew and Luke, but we don't find it in Mark. So of course, they're not getting this information from Mark. Either Luke is getting it from Matthew, or Matthew is getting it from Luke, or both are getting it from a common source that we no longer have. Most scholars think they're getting it from that common source. They give reasons for it. Not all scholars agree on it, but most think that Matthew and Luke got the information from a common source that we no longer have. Well, what do you call that source? Well, Gottlieb Stur, who is the German scholar who first noticed this, what do you call it? Well, the German word for source is Quelle. So you just abbreviate that with Q. That's all Q is. It's just a hypothetical source that Matthew and Luke used to supplement what they were already writing. I think that there was a Q source. And here's what I think it is. Papias, who mentions the authorship of Matthew and Mark, and he's the first to mention it, he doesn't say Matthew wrote a gospel. He doesn't say Matthew wrote a biography. He says that Matthew wrote the Greek is ta logia, the sayings, the teachings, the sayings of Jesus. What scholars notice is that the Q material that we find in Matthew and Luke are almost all exclusively teachings of Jesus, sayings of Jesus. And that makes sense then when Matthew says, Papias says that Matthew wrote these sayings of Jesus. That's what the Q material is. And Papias says he wrote it in the Aramaic, the Hebrew dialect, which probably refers to Aramaic. So I think Papias is referring to this, that Matthew, while he was listening to Jesus, took notes. And I think the Q material is Matthew's notes, which he later had translated into Greek. And then he had his secretary build Matthew's gospel by using Mark as the primary source, supplementing it with the notes, the Q material he had taken about Jesus' teachings, and then putting some other stories in there as well. So I think that Matthew was very much involved in the penning of that gospel. And so we would have eyewitness testimony. By the way, any of you who are interested in looking into this further, it is called the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem. And here we deal with what is Q, was Matthew written first, was Mark written first? And I have if you go to my YouTube channel, it's on the Risen Jesus podcast. We have a playlist for that. The Risen Jesus podcast, and it's season 2, the Synoptic Gospels. You can listen to it all seven or 8 episodes can be listened in 3.5 hours.
Okay. Okay, Mike, thank you, because I saw several questions about Q, and you have just covered that. All right, thank you. Now, a quick question, Mike, very short answer. What does the gospel mean, the word gospel?
The word gospel, euangelion in Greek, it means good news. And it's not unique to the Christians. When, let's say, an emperor or a general would win a battle for the Romans, they would send a messenger back to the city with the euangelion, the gospel, the good news about the victory. So again, this was not a term that the Christians coined, but it is one that they used to describe what they were writing. They were biographies of Jesus that brought the good news that God loves us and is offering us salvation, a relationship with God.